Hello, and welcome to Learning from Nature, the Biomimicry podcast with me, your host, Lily Ehrman. In this episode, I'm joined by a world-renowned biomimic who I have admired for many years. He is a mentor in this space for so many people, and it was an honor having a conversation with him. Especially in today's world, we need to not only envision a life-friendly future, but we need to begin building and strengthening the pathways to real systems change. We will explore some big questions in this discussion that I hope inspires folks to imagine what could be and help make it happen. Michael Pawlyn is an architect, writer, and public speaker. He has been described as an expert in regenerative design and biomimicry. He established his firm Exploration Architecture in 2007 to focus on high-performance buildings and solutions for the circular economy. The company has developed a groundbreaking office project, an ultra-low energy data center, a zero-waste textiles factory, and progressive solutions for green cities. He has written 2 books, Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency, co-authored with Sarah Ichioka, and Biomimicry in Architecture, which is the publisher's best-selling title of the last 15 years. In 2019, he jointly initiated Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency, a global call to action which has spread to 28 countries with over 8,000 firms signed up. His work has been featured in the Financial Times, National Geographic, The Economist, Wired, and The Guardian, as well as in a number of design magazines. His television and radio appearances include Animal Einsteins on BBC Television and a number of programs on BBC Radio 4. In recent years, he has been increasingly advising companies and national governments on how to make the shift from sustainable to regenerative ways of operating. So without further ado, let's hop on in. Happy to have you here chatting with me, Michael, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself and then maybe jump right into how you found out about biomimicry and how you found yourself in this field.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I've listened to lots of episodes and really enjoyed them, particularly the ones about knowledge symbiosis, actually. I think that's a really interesting initiative. Anyway, I'm Michael Pawlyn. I'm an architect, writer, and speaker. As a teenager, I was passionate about 3 things: design, biology, and the environment. And I thought about studying biology at university, but I couldn't quite see the creative side. So I went to study architecture. And then when I was 30, I had an opportunity to join Grimshaw to work on the Eden Project, which is this massive botanical visitor attraction in the southwest of England. The team was really interested in biomimicry, and I learned a huge amount from that. And then shortly after that project was finished, I had an amazing 5 days down at Schumacher College. It was a course that was led by Janine Benyus and Amory Lovins, and it was absolutely transformative. And that's when I really appreciated just how much depth and breadth there is to biomimicry as a discipline. Because I think most architects have heard about bits of biomimicry, spiders' webs and termite mouths and so on. But tends to be about it, or at least it was when I studied. That week with Janine and Amory, it kind of blew my mind really, and made me realize just what an amazing subject it is, and also how I could bring together those 3 strands of things that I was passionate about. And then after 10 years with Grimshaw, I decided to set up my own company so I could focus exclusively on biomimicry, and that was in 2007. And then since 2018, I've been framing it more within the shift from sustainable to regenerative, which I think has a kind of broader appeal. And I'm absolutely convinced that biomimicry has a huge contribution to make to regenerative design.
Yeah, and I'd also like for you to provide your definition of biomimicry. Everyone has such different definitions. I mean, there's like this core tenet, right? But I'd love for you to share how you define it.
So I've just finished writing the 3rd edition of my book, Biomimicry in Architecture. And this time I've tried to make a more transformative case for biomimicry. And so I'm using a definition which comes indirectly from Daniel Christian Wahl. I mean, I've changed it very slightly, but he said that biomimicry at its best is designing as nature. And I think that conveys very effectively the opportunity that biomimicry presents to really synergize our activities as humans with the rest of the living world.
Yeah, and I love how in this new version of the book, you really dive into that. I feel like everyone needs to read this, not only architects, but everybody. And something that I really noticed early on was this aligning to nature. So how do we align to nature, and what does it look like for humans to align with the rest of nature as this kind of core piece of biomimicry?
I just mentioned how I wanted to make a more transformative case. And that's partly because I feel that outside the field, people have heard about the kind of common examples of biomimicry, like, the trained nose cone and one or two others. And those are absolutely valid and they delivered performance benefits. But I think a lot of people within the field can see the more systemic possibilities, the potential to rethink our relationship with the rest of the living world and how we live and build. And there's been a very significant shift, at least in the UK and elsewhere, I'm sure, from a paradigm of sustainability towards regenerative culture. And I think there's a growing consensus that the ultimate aim is to get to the point where we are participating and co-evolving as nature. So far, a lot of the work that I see in regenerative design is rather incremental. I mean, it's good work. It's often people who are at that kind of neutral axis on the Bill Reed diagram of, trying to get above the point of just mitigating negatives into the realm of optimizing positives. And I think it's really important that we have in mind where we ultimately want to get to. And I believe that's to get to the point where we've learned to integrate everything we do as humans into the web of life. And thinking particularly about the built environment, biomimicry can really help us rethink things from first principles. And that starts with an understanding of living systems, and that in turn leads to various conclusions about the kind of materials we should be using or not using. And Janine has made the point that 96% of all living matter is made from just 4 elements. And of course, we use just about every element, which, including some that are absolutely crazy, like mercury and so on. Developing an understanding of living systems also leads to the conclusion that long-term toxins are just completely incompatible. So we need to completely design them out. And then from that understanding of systems, we can then learn from biological adaptations how to assemble those materials into efficient, beautiful structures, and how to manage light and water and energy in much more ingenious ways. And in this edition, Freya Matthews, the environmental philosopher, has been a really big influence. In one of her essays, she mentions a passage from Cradle to Cradle by McDonough and Braungart, where they suggest, okay, just imagine you're the manufacturer of a hair gel. What you should do is you should think about the river that hair gel will end up in and ask yourself, what does the river want from the hair gel? And Freya Matthews suggests that's along the right lines, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. And what we should be asking is, what does the river want us to desire in the first place? What does nature want us to desire? And I think that could prove to be one of the most fertile provocations in 21st century design. It makes you realize just how kind of human supremacist we've been about architecture. And all of a sudden it makes some of the best modernist buildings look like monuments to arrogance, really. And I think Freya Matthews is absolutely onto something there and really captures just how far it is that we need to go to properly align with life.
I think that statement beautifully sums up so much about biomimicry and reconnection. What does nature want from this design, right? It connects us to nature because we want something from the design. The outside world hopefully will benefit from the design, or at least not be harmed by the design. It's such a clear explanation of that. I love that. And you mentioned connectivity and pathways of least resistance. I'm curious if we can touch on that as a pathway to applying deeper biomimicry. You mentioned kind of these common examples. I feel like in the education space, people hear about biomimicry, they get excited about it, they take little pieces and they apply it in different ways. Some really meaningful and some just kind of surface level, which is a great start. But how do we push past that into, like you mentioned, this systems level rethinking?
I think biomimicry can facilitate a complete kind of rethinking of how we relate to the rest of the living world. And the reason I've picked up on Freya Matthews particularly is because I think those 2 principles of connectivity and least resistance are really useful. She describes those in an essay called A Deeper Philosophy of Biomimicry. As she describes it, connectivity is the impulse towards self-existence and self-increase, which is a characteristic of all living beings. And then the second principle of least resistance refers to the tendency to pursue connectivity in ways that minimize expenditure of effort or provoke least resistance from the rest of the system. And you can see that in mature ecosystems in a really beautiful way. And I think it also points to a really positive vision of how we could rethink our relationship with the rest of the living world. And that's the realm of indigenous knowledge, and the fact that there are numerous examples of places that have been inhabited by indigenous peoples, and those places have a higher level of biodiversity than places where people have been absent. So that shows that humans are capable of being a responsible keystone species. And to use Freya Matthews' terms, in those cases, those humans have engaged with the connectivity of the system and made themselves a part of it. They've kind of woven themselves into it.
And it is a seemingly, I think, simple approach, but it's really difficult to do well. And I think that's where like our current systems are failing us. And so I'd love to kind of dive into, some of the listeners might be familiar with systems thinking and leverage points. If you want to give a quick summary of leverage points and then really share like what are some leverage points in the current built environment system for that radical change that we need.
Yes. So I'm guessing you're referring to Donella Meadows' essay, Leverage Points. Is that right?
Yeah. And you mentioned it in this edition of the book, which is a really great connection to so many other things you discussed. And it's a huge topic, and we don't need to get into it too much, but just a brief summary to get us started.
Yeah, sure. And actually that essay was a really important part of the major shift in thinking that I had in 2018. So after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their report showing that things were far worse than we'd previously thought, and we only have a fairly narrow window of time to address this, I reread Donella Meadows' essay, Leverage Points, and that led me to embark on two new collaborations. So one was Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency, which is this kind of global call to action. And the other was a book, Flourish, that I wrote with Sarah Ichioka. And so both of those were based on Donella Meadows' ideas. And in that essay, she makes the case that very often when we're trying to bring about change, we intervene in the wrong places. And she sets out a list of places to intervene in a system in order of significance. And the most significant way to intervene is at the paradigm level. And by paradigm, she means the sort of mindset or worldview commonly held across a large section of society, which to a large extent determines how that society or system, if you like, operates. That's partly why, or substantially why, I've been making the case for this shift from sustainable to regenerative, because I think it had become clear that 30 years of sustainable design just had not got us anywhere near to where we needed to be. And in Flourish, Sarah and I really set out to try and describe the difference between sustainable and regenerative, both at a philosophical level and also in a sort of practical way, describing what that means, what would it actually look like in our cities and buildings.
And the world has a long way to go, I fear. And there's an excitement here of transitioning from sustainable to regenerative. Even in an academic sense, I teach an undergrad class, and I feel like universities are finally getting sustainability programs. And part of me is like, we are 30 years ahead of that. Now we need something new and something radical that prepares people to design not just for less bad, but how do we create systems that encourage positive feedback? So I think there's some frustration there because I want us to get there, and I can see that we can get there. But I guess a personal question that I have is, do you think we can do it in time? And maybe there's a better way to phrase this, but I think a lot of people are wondering this right now. Like, what is this massive challenge we have, right, to live regeneratively in harmony with nature? Seems so intuitive to the biomimics in the world and indigenous folks and so many folks who are connected to nature. And it's still seems so far from where we can get. And I guess, do you think we can do it?
Well, it's so much depends. And I'm increasingly coming to the view that actually we need an epochal shift equivalent to the level of change in thinking that occurred during the scientific revolution. And although that might sound like a really grand and in some ways kind of unachievable idea, when you look back at how epochal shifts have occurred in the past, it seems that they generally occur when enough people lose faith in the narratives that have dominated up to that point and become sufficiently persuaded by the emerging narratives of the new epoch. And I feel we're very much there in many ways. There are very few people who still believe that sustainability based on just being a bit less bad is going to get us there. I'm old enough to remember the kind of campaigns in the 80s and 90s for conscious consumerism saving the planet. And it's clear that while it has a part to play, there's no way that by itself is going to be enough. I think increasingly people are seeing that health needs to be considered in a broader sense in terms of planetary health. So our health and well-being as humans is inseparable from the well-being of the systems on which we depend. I think a lot of people have lost faith in the idea of environmental economics, where we try and essentially reconcile nature with capitalism and put a price on nature. And it's really encouraging to see ecological economics in the form of like donut economics and others really gaining ground. So I think we could get there. All the solutions we need exist. And I think one of the big transformations that we still need really is in our ideas of agency, in our ideas about our capacity to influence. And I'm thinking particularly of people in senior positions. I mean, the more senior you are, the more influence you have. And yet I still meet CEOs who kind of say, well, what can I do unless I get the shareholders on board? And someone amusingly told me about a mayor who said, well, what can I do? I'm only the mayor. And the problem with that kind of agency minimization is it's contagious. It tacitly permits other people to minimize their agency as well. But the positive thing is that if you flip that, and if we all strive to maximize our agency, that could have a positively contagious effect on others. And what we really need is this kind of rolling wave of agency maximization all the way up to the international levels.
Yeah, and really a lot of folks and organizations tapping into those leverage points and kind of, I'm thinking like lever. It makes it easier, right, to lift a car. And that lever is like, okay, we can shift this really heavy system if we know where to enter and what tools to use.
And I think you could also trace a kind of arc in business attitudes to the environment. So in the early stages, it was considered enough to have a kind of energy efficiency policy. And then there was an expectation there would be policies on ethical sourcing and then policies on diversity and then a policy on net zero. And I think where it needs to go next is that all companies need to have a deep purpose aligned with life and a theory of change for how to bring that about. And the reason that the theory of change part is important is because by going through that process, it's almost inevitable that those companies would find that some of the changes that need to happen are outside their currently perceived sphere of influence. And what they need to do is actually collaborate, sometimes with their competitors, sometimes with various levels of government, to bring about the conditions that allow them to still compete in commercial terms, but to do that within the limits of planet Earth.
No easy task, but I think we're up to it. And I also remind myself that most of Western society spent many hundreds of years extracting from and destroying the ecosystems around us and nature. And only in the last 50, 75 have we really woken up to this. And so we have a lot shorter of a timeline to get it done, but we've been doing it for less time and we've made so much progress in that time. That's what gives me hope as well. So bringing us down a little bit more into the tangible, I'd love to hear you share some examples of how buildings or maybe even cities as a whole kind of embody biomimicry or ecosystem principles. Like, what does that look like? Are people doing it? What are some stories of success?
Yeah. Well, this time round, I completely restructured the book so that I could start with systems because I think those are really fundamental. And I'm also a big fan of projects that have applied ecosystem principles. And there are some quite old and familiar ones like, Kalundborg in Denmark. And then there's the Tsume brewery that started off just producing brewery and a lot of waste. And then by integrating lots of other productive systems, managed to find synergies and ways of transforming waste into value. And the one I really like is one that was done in the north of England called the Cardboard to Caviar project. And it started with this kind of alchemical loop because what he did is he managed to transform cardboard, very low value material, into a high value material. And the way he did that was that he worked with people with disabilities, collecting cardboard from shops and restaurants, shredding it, selling it to equestrian centres as horse bedding. They were then paid to collect the manure and cardboard. They put it into wormery composting systems, which produced lots of worms, which they fed to Siberian sturgeon, which produced caviar, which they sold back to the restaurant. And then I invited myself up. I think this is when I was writing the first edition. I invited myself up to meet Graham Wiles, the guy who set it up. And in many ways, the more involved story was even more interesting because he kept on adding to it. Anytime he looked at something that was kind of leaking out of the system or anything that he found he had to buy in, he thought that was an opportunity to add something within his system. And so they found that the fish weren't putting on enough weight in winter because the water was too cold. And by this point, he'd been given a bit of industrial land next to a water treatment facility and as much treated fertilizer sludge as he wanted. So they planted willow biomass, which fed a little biomass boiler, which kept the fish happy in winter. And then he started working with teenagers on drug rehab programs, growing vegetables to make fish food to supplement the worms. And actually, these teenagers ate most of the vegetables, but in many ways that was a good thing because they were learning about healthier eating, so that was fine. And then also those teenagers were actually on very expensive rehab programs. They were nearly £100,000 per addict per year with a very high failure rate. And Graham has achieved an 80% success rate at getting them off drugs and into something much more productive for an absolute fraction of that money. The next thing was that they restored more industrial land. They planted orchards that was producing fruit. That was another thing to sell to the shops and restaurants. They redesigned the water treatment for the fish. So using suspended tanks of watercress, a salad crop, that would take out the excess nitrates and phosphates, and then that water could go back into the fish tanks and the watercress could be sold. Then he heard that there was a bakery nearby that was chucking away quite a lot of moldy bread each week. And apparently you can raise maggots on moldy bread with none of the smells of meat-based production. And he just kept on adding to this system. And there was a real sense in which the more it grew, the more the number of possibilities increased. Just like an ecosystem that becomes more and more diverse and rich over time. And what I love about that project is that he applied nearly all the principles of ecosystems. And in my book, I contrast the conventional characteristics of human-made systems with those of ecosystems. I think it's also amazing just how inventive he was with waste, all sorts of waste, including what is arguably the most deplorable form of waste, which is underutilized human resources. He managed to reintegrate often marginalized groups into this regenerative scheme. It had an amazing positive impact on this industrial land. It became a haven for biodiversity. And I think it also points to a new economic model. So in our conventional economic model, physical and financial resources are mobilized and they flow very quickly through our communities, ending up as waste for the money, a lot of that ending up in the hands of very big companies. But with this model, based on the Cardboard to Caviar project, you can see the potential for those resources to do multiple cycles, delivering far more value and providing a whole new sector of our economy, potentially. It's the equivalent of the detritivores in living systems. So it's the repairers, the recyclers, and so on. And I also talk about how a group at Georgia Tech, led by Mark Weisberg, have taken some of these principles even further by applying scientific principles that are used to study real ecosystems. And they compared real ecosystems with some of these eco-industrial parks, as they're sometimes called, where you get a clustering of industries that share their waste and so on. And they found some really interesting opportunities to take that even further by applying deeper scientific principles. Now, the built environment example that comes closest to this so far, I think, is Hammarby Sjöstad, which is an extension to the city of Stockholm in Sweden. And during the early stages of the project, they actually got the major utility companies, the energy, water, waste companies to all cooperate in the master planning of this scheme. And although it's not perfect, I think it shows a great potential for how much further we can go. Because I really do think that this idea of ecosystem models is one of the biggest and most underexplored aspects of the circular economy.
Yeah, and there are so many great ones in this version of your book that made me really hopeful. And it was cool to see and hear about these examples. So Learn Biomimicry is hosting their biannual Biomimicry Confluence this October online. I'll be there, and so will some incredible biomimicry keystone speakers, some of which you've heard on this very podcast. Now in its second year, the Biomimicry Confluence is becoming the space where nature-inspired ideas, innovations, and biomimics flow together. Learn Biomimicry gets the world of biomimicry into one room with breakout networking sessions in small, intimate groups. It feels like a TED Talk and a good dinner party all in one. Hear about the latest biomimicry innovations, how AI and biomimicry are overlapping, and what's working in this field. The Biomimicry Confluence is a must-attend event for those who wish to learn, connect, and be inspired by what nature can teach us. Head to learnbiomimicry.com to learn more. And I would love to dive a little bit into your first version of biomimicry and architecture came out 2011, and then this version is coming out later this year. What has happened in those 14 years that is really exciting for you as far as making these systems level changes, biomimicry changes, more of a reality and less of an ideology?
Yeah. So there have been some quite substantial shifts. So thinking of some of those ecosystem principles, conventionally human systems tended to be very monofunctional and isolated, whereas ecosystems are multifunctional and densely interconnected. And now urban developments, the default really is mixed use. It is a diversity of uses, which gives much greater opportunities for these kind of synergies to be achieved. It's also promising to see a really fundamental shift in agriculture towards regenerative agriculture. Now, I know that that term is being kind of used and abused a bit.
But at least it's out there. People are talking about it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then I also think it's really positive that we're now talking more about how humans are nature. So
Yeah.
in the UK, there's I think it's here, there's a campaign to change the dictionary definition of nature. So it's kind of laughable when you read this definition. It says something like all the living species of planet Earth as opposed to humans. So I think that point has been very well made, that we are nature. And what that prompts really is a question, all right, so if we are nature, what comes next? What does that mean for the way we live and build? What does it mean to design as nature?
Yeah, that's the big question. And what does nature want from our designs? That one gets me thinking. Another thing I really love in the book are these comparison tables you have that kind of showcase human technology or our current manufacturing techniques and nature's methods. And it's so clear we have a ways to go because natures are so aligned with these regenerative principles, right? Waste as a resource, for example. And I'm curious, seeing those comparisons side by side, like what are some technologies or processes that you've seen recently or in the past that are going to help us make that shift from harmful and maybe obsolete single function to life-friendly, multifunctional, and regenerative? What will allow us to get there, basically?
Well, in the book, I'm wary of talking too much about technology. And in some ways, 3D printing is a really good case in point because it shows how important the kind of worldview is, or the mindset that lies behind any particular technology, because that to a large extent determines what comes out of it. So 3D printing within a conventional mindset of sustainability could easily see us drowning in millions of tons of short life consumerist crap, bluntly. But within a regenerative mindset, it could be really transformative because it could allow us to use exactly the right materials to assemble them in much more ingenious and efficient ways, and in ways that allow near perfect circularity. And in my studio, we've explored that a bit. So we designed some exhibition tables a few years ago that were based on bone and tree growth patterns. And they were 3D printed out of a biologically derived polymer. And they look really organic. They look a lot like kind of water lily branching and so on.
I got to see one. It was great at the Biomimicry Center. Right. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And, there's nothing accidental about those forms. It's actually trying to get as close as possible to a theoretically perfect structure. And what I mean by that is trying to put the material in exactly the right place so that it's using a minimum of materials to achieve its intended aim. Now, of course, structures aren't always quite as simple as that because often you have kind of multiple load cases, wind and snow and seismic and so on. But anyway, as a simple study of how those ideas can be turned into something efficient and beautiful, I think it was a really good project. And 3D printing, I think, can also help in this shift towards biomaterials, which in turn is going to help us shift towards these systems that are aligned with life and that work on the same principles as ecosystems. Because, biomaterials are so much easier to dismantle. when they're made in living organisms, they're assembled using low energy bonds. It's all non-toxic stuff. And so it's just much more compatible. And then within this chapter about materials, there are some other examples that I look at, like self-healing ideas inspired by nature and developed into a built environment solution. And the reason I was particularly interested in that is because when we worked on the Eden project, the enclosure there is an inflated membrane. It's called ETFE, ethyl tetrafluoroethylene. And it achieved the kind of thing that Amory Lovins loved talking about, which is a factor 100 saving. So it was about 1% of the weight of double glazing. And there were then lots of knock-on savings because with a much lighter enclosure, we needed less structure. With less structure, we needed less foundations. We were also getting more sunlight in, so we didn't need to put as much heat in and so on. So it was a great positive cycle. But one of the drawbacks with those pressurized structures is that they are susceptible to puncture damage. And the example I talk about in the book comes from, I think it's Olga and Thomas Speck in Germany. And they were inspired by a particular vine, which has a self-repairing adaptation. And the way they've applied it to pressurized membranes is that on the inside of the membrane, there are rows of little pressurized cells, a bit like bubble wrap. Do you call it bubble wrap?
Yeah.
And so if there's a puncture, those cells then immediately expand and seal up the hole. And after they developed this, they found that it's sealed in a fraction of a second. And that's a really elegant solution to something like pneumatic structures, which offer great potential. And then another project that I think demonstrates some of the useful contrasts between conventional engineering in terms of materials and the way nature makes materials is one that we've been working on called the BioRock Pavilion, where we're exploring ideas of environmentally influenced self-assembly. And perhaps the clearest way of describing that for your listeners is if you imagine a tree on a kind of windswept cliff and it adopts really quite a windswept form, the tree is building up tissue where there's concentrations of force. And in this project, the BioRock Pavilion, it's a serious proposal to grow a building in seawater through electrodeposition of minerals. And it's an existing technology called BioRock, but so far it's only been used for coral reef restoration. What we thought would be fun, and this was a suggestion from Julian Vincent, was that on some of the steel rods, if we actually had a strain gauge on those, it would give a reading of the force that existed in that member. And we could then use that to direct a little bit more current to that piece of steel. So the ones that were under the most loading would grow more until they are strong enough to resist what they need to.
Yeah, there's some really wonderful examples of how nature does that and how we're learning from that, which is really cool. And that reminds me of a statement that's early on in this version. And I forget if it's a quote. It might be a quote, but it says the combination of evolved adaptations and human ingenuity exceeds the power of each alone. And I love that. It's a beautiful description of we can tap into billions of years of research and development in the natural world. And we do need our creativity to apply those, to adapt those strategies to what we need in the challenges that we have. And I'm curious if there's some examples of like the buildings and cities world where you can give me of like, this is an abstracted version of biomimicry, kind of like what you just were saying. And we needed human ingenuity in order to do that. Like it wouldn't exist without human ingenuity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worth just distinguishing between how evolution has produced adaptations and how humans think. And that's why I think the kind of combination of those is very fertile. So evolution works by improving on what exists and refining that over eons through just countless numbers of experiments, for want of a better word. But one of the disadvantages of that is that sometimes you get a kind of a branching path that goes off in a slightly suboptimal direction. And then the adaptations just improve on that. And so there's an Australian geneticist called Jenny Graves who says, well, the human eye is actually pretty stupidly designed compared to a squid eye. A human eye is all back to front. But somewhere along the line, we departed from the squid and ours turned out to be nowhere near as good. And then human ingenuity, unlike evolution, is capable of creating something out of thin air. It's capable of completely original invention with no precedent. But one of the problems with humans is that we're prone to a whole range of unconscious biases, and we can often get stuck in certain ways of doing things. And I think biomimicry can help us overcome some of those obstacles by exposing us to a vast range of potential solutions to contemporary challenges. And the example that I normally use in talks to describe this is the medical drill that was inspired by a wood wasp. So the wood wasp has this ovipositor which can drill into wood, but making something that rotates continuously in nature, that's just very challenging with living tissue. And its solution is a drill bit in two semicircular halves, which move back and forth relative to each other in a sort of reciprocating motion. And they've got ridges on them. So when it puts that in a crack in the wood, it can pull on one side and then push with the other. And the result is a zero net pushing force drill. That's now been turned into a medical drill that can be used in very delicate surgery. So using virtually no pushing force, it can drill into a skull. And because the drill bit's in two semicircular halves, it can follow a curved path. And that's the kind of thing that I think humans would be very unlikely to have come up with. And it's a huge improvement on something that up until that point we'd been using all along, which was like a rigid, continuously rotating drill bit.
Yeah, that's why I like to say that biomimicry is humbling in some sense, right? Like there's some stuff that we would have never thought of. And then combined with our creativity and our ideation, we can create some really hopeful technology and design and products to make a more regenerative future, which I'm really excited about. And that's where I think so many folks get attracted to biomimicry, because it's almost like, oh yeah, of course.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like coming home, and that reconnection is so natural as well.
It's also really handy, when you're trying to persuade a client to do something innovative, if you can show that it already exists, it's effectively proven.
Yeah.
It kind of sets up this challenge. If a beaver or whatever can do it, then we ought to be able to do it because we're an ingenious species.
Yeah. And then those moments where like photosynthesis, where we can't quite get to the exact same efficiency because we haven't 100% figured it out yet. And that to me is like, yeah, we're these genius creatures, but also we have a long way to go.
Got a bit to learn.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about some of your, maybe one or two of your like favorite organic forms. You mentioned a couple so far in this interview, why they're your favorite, and then maybe tell us some of their interesting features. I know listeners love to nerd out, so this is our moment to nerd out on cool stuff in nature. And then what makes it inspiring to you? Are there things built based off of these principles, or feel free to go down that rabbit hole if you want.
Sure. So one that I really like is the abalone shell, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for your listeners' benefit, when you look at it under a powerful microscope, you can see that it's made of lots of layers of calcium carbonate polygons, and those are connected with a flexible protein. And that gives it amazing resistance to crack propagation. So at a chemical level, it's almost identical to ordinary blackboard chalk, but because of those interfaces and that microstructure, it achieves 3,000 times the toughness. And there's a method of building that is very similar to this. It's called Guastavino vaulting, sometimes called Catalan vaulting. And it was actually very popular in previous centuries. There were a lot of buildings built this way in New York. It's still built quite a bit in Spain. And there was quite a well-publicized building in South Africa, a visitor center, the Mapungubwe Visitor Center, made this way. And what I'm keen to explore is using waste material to have a go at this. Though if you look at an example like slate, though slate is an incredibly wasteful industry. So I think more than 95% of the material is actually wasted. And it's just small flat pieces of stone, which are really quite similar to abalone in many ways. So I'm keen to explore that. And that's partly because there's this sort of abundant amount of material waiting to be used, but also because the forms are just so beautiful and efficient. They have this just kind of legible clarity and efficiency to them. So that's one that I'm really keen on. And then another one is bird skulls. So I find those are a really fantastic embodiment of structural efficiency in nature. And what you have is these like domes of very thin, bony material connected together with little struts and ties. And it really gets across something that Julian Vincent talks about, which is that in nature, materials are expensive and shape is cheap. And what that means is nature kind of puts the material exactly where it needs to be. And conventionally, that used to be quite expensive because that kind of complicated approach just meant more labor and more expense. But now, with 3D printing, it has the potential to be cheaper because you can, in theory, you should be able to use less material. And there's no real cost penalty for complexity in 3D printing. Yeah, so those are the main ones that occur to me at the moment.
Yeah. I'm glad you pulled out that quote, material is expensive, shape is cheap, because that really spoke to me as well. Like if we can get even some of the efficiency that pretty much all structures in nature get to inherently because they have to, that's the way evolution designed them. And the structures that aren't efficient don't exist anymore. And that shape complexity on a nanoscale, on a micro scale, yeah, if we can start integrating some of those principles, I feel like we would make a lot of really big shifts inherently, which is exciting. I asked this of all my guests, and I'd love to hear, we talked a little bit on the darker side earlier. I'd love to hear what's giving you hope. And right now, what are you excited about currently or coming up in the future?
I sometimes wonder if I have a different understanding of the word hope to others, because for me, there's something a bit sort of detached and forlorn about it. And so I prefer to use words like determined rather than hopeful. And this was also what Sarah and I were talking about really when we talked about possibilism in our Flourish, that in a way it's not enough to be optimistic or pessimistic, because those imply that the future is something that happens to you. Whereas with possibilism, you need to work together with others to create a commonly held idea of the future and then actually set about making that happen. And that's what I really think we need to do. We need to get better at maximizing our agency. But I'll stop being an awkward guest now.
No, I love that. It's going to cause me to go down a philosophical rabbit hole later.
I mean, in terms of where I see bright spots, I think, that is a really important question when things are looking so bleak. And one I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that we are nature, is now gathering momentum. I think that's really positive, because inevitably, I think people are going to think, all right, well, how do we actually align with life? And then I think it's very positive that regenerative design is gathering momentum, and people are starting to realize that a lot of the things that we did within sustainability were just kind of nonsense, really. It was very common for, and it still is to some extent, for big practices to just focus all their PR efforts on a couple of projects that are pushing boundaries of sustainability, while the rest of their portfolio is nowhere near that standard. Now, I mean, seriously, is nature going to be fooled by that? Of course not. We're only going to actually be having a net positive impact when we are net positive across all our projects.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other shift that I think is very positive is the shift towards citizens thinking. So, there was a time when the way we identified as humans was as a subject, subject to a monarch or a theocrat. And then with the modern era, we started to see ourselves as consumers. And it's easy to see how that must have felt quite liberating after the kind of suffocating traditional views and so on. And then the idea of being consumers, that started to reveal its own drawbacks, and the idea of conscious consumerism came in. And now we can see that that's not really enough. And so the next shift is about seeing ourselves as citizens with a much richer and deeper sense of agency. And so saying, well, no, I don't want to just choose from what's on the menu. I actually want to challenge why that is the limit of options. And I also want to rethink the way we currently do democracy, because it's absolutely hopeless to just have one vote every 4 or 5 years. And some of the examples of participatory forms of democracy, either in terms of participatory budgeting or in citizens' assemblies, I think have been hugely successful. And I think that's a really positive development, because it seems that people often achieve a kind of transformation. I think the outcomes of them have a lot of legitimacy if it's been set up correctly, because the group are supposedly representative of the whole nation. And it allows people to actually engage in a more informed assessment of important issues. We had this disastrous Brexit vote in the UK, a hugely significant vote. And it was based on a huge amount of misinformation. It was the most insane act of national self-harm ever. Anyway, I better not go down that. But, I really do think that a kind of revitalization of our democracy is essential. And if I may just extend one thing further, I'm getting more and more interested in theories of change and what constitutes an effective theory of change. And I feel that we haven't really, the we I'm talking about is maybe the built environment professionals or society more broadly. We haven't really talked enough about the obstacles to progress. And in Holling and Gunderson's adaptive cycle model, which shows that complex systems go through, or suggests that complex systems go through 4 stages of growth, consolidation, release, and renewal. That consolidation stage, I think, is really interesting because that's the stage in which the system becomes more and more resistant to outside change. In fact, it responds to outside change by becoming more and more resistant. And in social or political examples, I think we're very much in that stage now. Governments and business and oligarchs and tech billionaires have become way too close to each other, and they're very effectively blocking meaningful change. We really do have to address that. And I hope that happens by peaceful means.
Yeah, I think something's going to happen either way. I think that, like you said, people are really coming into awareness, and it's a big shift that I'm hoping happens soon because we need it to. All right. And then last thing, I just want you to share about the upcoming book release and where people can find that book and any other projects you have going on that you want to share about.
Sure. Okay. So it's published in this country on September the 1st. It's called Biomimicry and Architecture, 3rd edition. This time it's bigger, it's been rewritten, and it's also, this time I've been working with a brilliant illustrator called Marcia Hiotic, which has really helped to describe some of the ideas in greater clarity. You can buy it from the publisher's websites, RIBA Publications. It'll also be available on Amazon and quite possibly in some of the more specialist bookshops. I think it'll arrive be available in the US from sort of mid to late September. And of course, there's a digital version as well, if you'd rather have a digital version.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. This was a joy to talk to you.
Well, likewise, Louis. Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for everything you're doing.
I appreciate you all for listening in today and for being a part of this beautiful web of change makers across the globe. I'm excited to continue to share my own journey and invite guests that inspire us and give us a greater sense of curiosity for our genius world. This is a quick reminder that we have some really awesome nature nerd merch like shirts and stickers so you can help support the podcast and look cool on your next hike. These were custom designed by my friend and incredible artist Sarah Williams, and they showcase the amazing range of unique organisms here on Earth. You can grab yours at learningfromnature.earth/merch. I also want you all to know how much I appreciate every review, rating, recommendation, and support as you are all helping biomimicry reach more people. Together, we can not only imagine, but create a beautiful world with life at the forefront and guiding the way. This episode was brought to you by Learn Biomimicry. If you're wanting to start your own biomimicry journey, they have a special offer for my listeners. I've known about Learn Biomimicry for ages and actually was a mentor for one of their programs briefly a few years ago. I've seen firsthand the impact it can have on folks. This is your chance to better understand biomimicry in just 3 short courses, all with the depth of a degree and the ease of a TED Talk. Today, Learn Biomimicry has helped more than 1,679 learners from over 41 countries practice biomimicry in their personal and professional lives. They've brought biomimicry to every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, although that could change, you never know. All my listeners save $60 when you purchase the Biomimicry short course set. There's also a free ebook to get you started. Use the coupon code LEARNINGFROMNATURE with no spaces, or head to www.learnbiomimicry.com/learningfromnature. That's all one word. www.learnbiomimicry.com/learningfromnature. Happy learning!